All right, guys, so this is a continuation of the Gilded Age. We got cut off just a little bit short, but that's okay. I can improvise because I am a professional. All right, so back to the captains of industry thing. Now, these robber barons, the big debate was, are these individuals like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt, are they, in fact, captains of industry, where they are actually individuals who are just the reason why America became so great? They are just so smart, so knowledgeable, and so effective that they are to be the commanders of America's economic ship. Or are these individuals actual robber barons? People that just use the system of laissez-faire and free enterprise, exploit their workers, and pay them incredibly low amounts, as well as work them long hours and keep all the profits, making them robber barons. Well, it's always a big debate. You can take one side or the other. That's not for us to decide right now. We'll leave that for you to dwell upon and chew upon when you get to college. But as of right now, how did these individuals justify a lot of their wealth? Well, a lot of them believed in the concept of what was called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, obviously, they believed that, kind of along the lines of Darwin and the evolution of the species and survival of the fittest, that they, in fact, were the epitome of society, the epitome of the business world. Nature had designed them to be the top and the apex predator of the business world. Everybody else that worked for them, well, nature designed them to be down there and be the workers. So naturally, they should be able to treat them however they wanted to because nature designed it that way. Now, did all robber barons believe this? No, but a good deal of them did. Now, one of the individuals who will resist a little bit about this concept, at least have somewhat of a change of heart later on in his life, of course, we know is going to be Carnegie. Carnegie is going to be associated with what's going to be called later on as the social gospel or the gospel of wealth, which is going to be his main essay. And the social gospel essentially is, you know what, we people who have profited a good bit off of society, who have used America and Americans to enrich ourselves, well, we deserve the opportunity to give back to them. If we made millions and hundreds of millions off of them, well, it's only right for us to give back to them. That's why a lot of these individuals become philanthropists. Carnegie is going to give back over $350 million in museums, hospitals, universities in an attempt to make society better as a whole. The important thing to remember is it's not giving to specific individuals. The idea of the social gospel and the gospel of wealth is to give back to society as the whole. And don't forget that really Andrew Carnegie is the guy that you really need to try to associate this with, especially when it comes to STAR, if it's going to be asked. Now, let's look at some of those individuals who are actually working for a lot of these robber barons. And we're going to talk about immigration in America during the Gilded Age. Now, we know a lot of the immigration that's going to happen in the Gilded Age is still going to come from what's called Old Europe, old immigration. England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, France, even parts of Germany are going to work their way over here to the United States because there are already connections here. Why? Well, because you have the push-pull factor. There's a lot of things pushing them out. We had starvation, like you saw in Ireland with the potato famine. You're going to see a lot of religious persecution, political persecution. There was a lot of individuals that had nothing for them back home. So that's going to push them out. And what pulls them in? Well, obviously, it's going to be the opportunity for new jobs. And that's going to give us our little triangle of cooperation in the United States in the Gilded Age, which is the idea that America was building in their industries, which meant, man, there's jobs available. If there's jobs available and we needed people, then by gosh, bring us, you're tired, you're weak, bring us everybody that you've got, bring us those that have no hope in your immigration so you can come and work in our factories and maybe make it and achieve the American dream. Well, as immigration really swells inside of the United States, what happens? Well, we have the growth of cities. Our cities become congested, overcrowded, they spread out. Well, this is going to lead to more individuals, but more individuals means more customers to buy stuff. If there's more customers to buy stuff, then by gosh, we're going to have more industrial output, which is going to require more immigration, and the circle of economic life continues. Or whatever. So, now, these immigrants coming in, of course, were not only looking for, obviously, a job because they were available, but they were actually looking for a better way of life. And a lot of these people, when they show up, where do they show up? Well, a lot of them come to Ellis Island and hope to achieve the American dream. In other words, they wanted to go from rags to riches. They had heard about it. They had read about it in a lot of these little Horatio Alger novels about people coming and starting with nothing as a child and working their way up to have lavish amounts of wealth and leaving things off better for their families later on, which is really the American dream, the idea that your future generation, your offspring, will do better than you did, and then their offspring will do better than they did, and just go and go and go. That basically it was limitless, your opportunities here in America. Well, where did they come into? Well, in New York, we know most of them came into Ellis Island, where they went through a very rigorous immigration process. I mean, they checked their health, they checked their identities, their records. They had to prove they were not going to be a burden on the United States. They had to prove that they could take care of themselves and were going to assimilate. And then from then, the process of moving into the cities would begin to happen. Now, if it was the Asians, especially the Chinese or Japanese, they went into San Francisco around normally Angel Island in a different part of San Francisco, but the process was essentially going to be the same. But as we know, a lot of these immigrants are going to wind up showing up in the cities and establishing their little ethnic neighborhoods. They would wind up showing up living in places like Little Italy or Little Ireland or Chinatown, giving the cities these little cultural flavors that we even still experience today. But as we know, when immigration happens very fast, there's going to be those Americans, those natural-born Americans, who are really opposed to this. This is going to lead to the rise of nativism during the Gilded Age. And of course, this is the extreme hatred of foreigners and the idea that they were coming here to change the culture, change the way of life. And a lot of Americans didn't like that, and they wanted to limit their immigration. And of course, you see the cartoon here we've seen before, immigration, and here's all the different fruits immigration actually provides, but we're going to chop it down because we're afraid of changing America's way of life. And probably one of the more famous cartoons that's normally on star exams and others, of course, is the hypocritical cartoon, where you see the descendants of immigrants here, and of course, their descendants become much wealthier. And then, of course, the hypocrisy is, although they come from immigrants, it's okay for them to be here, but by gosh, we don't want any new immigrants coming in. So that's the idea of the hypocrisy of nativism. Well, now I guess if there's going to be one particular group that's going to be discriminated against the most, it is going to be the Chinese. Now, the Chinese in Asia that came in from China into the United States, mostly because of an agreement that we initially made with a couple of provinces in China to actually have them come over to help with the railroads and etc. Well, Americans over there in the West Coast weren't happy about the change that they were bringing into their cities. They just spoke a different language. They had a different appearance. They were taking some rather menial jobs. They just didn't seem like they assimilated into the American culture, and the fear was that they would wind up taking over. So we're actually going to pass a law that will limit their immigration called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which really prevented them from becoming citizens as well as limited their immigration for roughly 10 years. So that's going to be one of the early attempts by the nativists to begin limiting immigration. Now, obviously, we've got to talk about the growth of the cities, which is the urbanization side of it. This is sort of the darker side when it comes to the Gilded Age. This is some of that corrosion underneath the gold that America looked at. Now, where are these immigrants living in the cities? Well, I think we all know in those little apartments and those overcrowded little dwellings called tenements. And normally they were run down in the worst part of the cities, not well managed, and they would be overcrowded and the conditions filled with disease, crime, etc. Now, a lot of the United States, especially within the cities, half the city didn't want to acknowledge this really existed. These were just workers to work and don't worry about it. But there were some individuals that wanted to bring attention to it. And of course, one individual who we've talked about before, a muckraker named Jacob Riis, will publish the book/essay and the photo expose called How the Other Half Lives, which is basically depicting the lives of the immigrants in the tenements and the workers who worked in the factories to bring somewhat of a social awareness to the upper class and upper middle class Americans in the cities. Jacob Riis's book is going to be very influential because the partnering with Jacob Riis's books is going to also encourage some other individuals to get involved to try to help the immigrants. And of course, we're going to have to talk about Miss Jane Addams. Jane Addams is going to establish a way to try to help these immigrants by establishing the settlement house movement, notably the Hull House located in Chicago, which of course was going to be designed primarily to help immigrants assimilate, provide some health care for them, as well as maybe some child care and some education in an attempt to try to help them adjust to the United States and help them get by. It's sort of a moral Christian thing to do. Jane Addams is actually going to win the Nobel Peace Prize for this, the first woman to do so. Now, starting the settlement house movement is going to move further on throughout other parts of the country, becomes very effective. Make sure you remember Jane Addams. She's very important when it comes to helping the immigrants during the Gilded Age. Now, when you talk about the birth of the unions in the Gilded Age, obviously, why are they going to wind up forming unions? Obviously, these are workers that get together to try to demand better pay and better working conditions for themselves because things were not going well. So if you're going to talk about somebody that is one of the very first organizers of a union during the Gilded Age, we got to talk about the socialist Mr. Eugene Debs. Yes, I know, I love his hair too. Now, Eugene Debs, of course, was a very prominent socialist who's actually going to run for president a number of times, actually winds up getting arrested once for violating the Espionage Act later on, but we'll get into that later. He's going to be the powerful leader of the American Railway Union. He's actually going to organize a couple of strikes. Now, the problem with this is the more strikes that we see these unions begin to form and begin to participate in, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1887, which becomes very destructive, people start assuming unions as being very violent, that these are anarchists, these are individuals that cannot be negotiated with, these are anti-Americans, and so the sentiment towards unions was very negative. Normally the government, it's always side on the side of the business owners, not the workers, but the business owners, because they viewed unions as hurting capitalism, which was anti-American. But you will still have some unions come into power and try to do their best to make efforts better and lives better for some of the workers. And probably one of the more proficient ones early on is going to be the first industrialized union, which is going to be the Knights of Labor. But of course, you know, the Knights of Labor are going to have a bit of a problem. Yeah, they were arguing for some good things that eventually America is going to adopt, like, the 8-hour workday, the use of arbitration, a third party to come in and help negotiate between the businesses and the workers, as well as the right to actually go on strike without the fear of losing your job or being beaten up or being blacklisted in some other place, not ever being able to work again. Well, they were fairly effective early on until we know an instance where the Haymarket Square riot happens when the Knights of Labor are out protesting at a rally, and all of a sudden some violence breaks out, a bomb gets thrown, a few police officers and some other individuals get killed, and obviously the people they're going to blame are the Knights of Labor because they were already assumed as being violent individuals. Well, as soon as this happens, the Knights of Labor, their membership plummets because nobody wants to be associated with somewhat of a violent, maybe possibly anarchist group. Well, after the Knights of Labor, one that's a little bit more stable comes around called the American Federation of Labor, led by this Mr. Sexy Beast, Mr. Samuel Gompers, who's going to be the first union leader. Now, the AFL-CIO, later to be called, actually is going to become much more effective because they are not going to be advocating violence, really. They're much more open to simple negotiations and simple things like the 8-hour workday and a better wage, and maybe even working maybe just 6 days a week instead of 7. But we know throughout the United States, continued strikes are going to happen and they're going to continue to become violent. And as we see the Homestead strike, it becomes incredibly violent at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mill. A couple people wind up dead. The military has to come in. The Pullman Railroad strike, it's a nationwide strike. Railroad workers block the railroad tracks. We could not have the railroads stop. That would choke off America. Unions begin to get a very bad viewpoint. And of course, they looked at as un-American and drop. Finish up the Gilded Age.